Hi, it's Stephen Shalowitz here from the One Way Ticket Show. I'm excited to announce our new YouTube channel, where we're featuring some of our classic episodes and releasing new ones as well. Do subscribe to the channel and make sure you ring that bell below so you never miss an episode. From New York City, I'm Stephen Shalowitz, and this is the One Way Ticket Show. Hello and welcome once again to another episode of the show where we explore with our guests where they'd go if given a one-way ticket, no coming back. Their destinations may be in the past, present, future, real, imaginary, or even a state of mind. But once again, the only caveat, there's no coming back. You can listen to all episodes on our website, theonewayticketshow.com. Once again, theonewayticketshow.com. Or you can search for the One Way Ticket Show wherever you like to download your podcasts. And while you're at it, do rate and review us, 5 stars, of course, which helps to make it easier for more folks around the world to find us. And if you haven't done so already, do follow me on all social media. At Stephen Shalowitz is my handle. At Stephen Shalowitz. Stephen is with a V. Would love to connect with each and every one of you. And also, if you want to jot me a note, well, my email address is Stephen@theonewayticketshow.com. Once again, Stephen@theonewayticketshow.com. All right, as for this episode, we are truly honored to welcome back General David H. Petraeus to the program, who is our guest on episode 268 back in 2022. The world has indeed changed so much since then. A retired U.S. Army general and a prominent commentator on contemporary issues, security issues, military developments, and global affairs, the general is widely respected as a leading warrior intellectual. He graduated with distinction from the U.S. Military Academy and earned a PhD from Princeton University. He served in the U.S. Army for 37 years, concluding his time in uniform with 6 consecutive commands as general officer, 5 of which were in combat, including command of the surge in Iraq, U.S. Central Command, and the International Security Assistance Force in Afghanistan. He then served as the director of the CIA. The general has held academic appointments at 6 universities and is a senior fellow and lecturer at Yale University. He is currently a partner in a major investment firm and chairs that firm's Global Institute. And on top of all of that, the general is also a brilliant author. His latest book, Conflict, The Evolution of Warfare from 1945 to Ukraine, came out at the end of last year and is an absolute must-read. He co-wrote it with noted biographer and historian Andrew Roberts. It's published by Harper, an imprint of HarperCollins, and I truly urge you to pick up a copy of it wherever you like to buy your books. I absolutely plowed through it and loved it. And with that, we warmly welcome General David H. Petraeus back to the One Way Ticket Show, who joins us now on the line via Zoom. General, welcome back. It's great to see you again.
Good to be back with you, Stephen. Thank you.
All right. Listen, we already covered your very creative response to my question, where you would go if given a one-way ticket in our last conversation. So I'm going to direct our listeners to that interview, which once again is on episode 268. And while I want to focus our conversation on your book, again, congratulations. It's called Conflict for you, our dear listeners. I would really be remiss if I didn't first ask you about the Israel-Gaza war and Iran's recent attack on Israel. And we should share with our listeners that we are recording this episode, this conversation on Tuesday, the 16th of April. So the world just may do 10,000 somersaults before I release the episode a few days from now. But I first want to ask you, as it relates to that conflict, are there any lessons, General, from history that you think Israeli leaders should look to as they're making their decisions on how to proceed with a response?
First of all, I think there are a lot of lessons from history on what they have sought to do in Gaza. And I think we might discuss those in a bit more detail, including lessons that we learned, many of them the hard way, in the early years in Iraq, before the conduct of the surge, which of course I was privileged to command, where I think we finally got it all together and cleared and held and rebuilt major urban centers. Fallujah, the 3rd time that we tried that, and that one worked. Ramadi, Baquba, parts of Baghdad, Mosul, and a variety of other major cities. None of them remotely as fiendishly difficult as is the challenge in Gaza, where you have an enemy that doesn't wear a uniform, that uses civilians as human shields, that's holding well over 100 hostages, that has 350 miles of very developed subterranean facilities and tunnels, that knows the neighborhood intimately et cetera, et cetera. So this is a very challenging situation. Again, much more so than any other urban operation really since the end of 1945, including those that we cover, for example, Hue and Vietnam and some others. But there are some aspects to what it is that we did that I think are relevant. And foremost among those would be the campaign design that you have in mind. And in my view, while they're fighting in a way conventionally, keeping in mind that Hamas is organized into battalions and brigades and so forth, and there's about 4 battalions that have not yet been defeated or destroyed. Keep in mind that the military doctrinal term or definition for destroy is to render the enemy incapable of accomplishing his mission without reconstitution. Keep your eye on without reconstitution. But as this campaign goes on, I think it's more appropriate as time passes to think of it as a counterinsurgency campaign, which should be a comprehensive civil military operation in which you don't just clear an area, you actually hold it and you keep the population secure from the terrorists, in this case, Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad. If you don't do that, if you just clear and leave or go on to another area, then the enemy will re-infiltrate behind you and the gains will be a bit more ephemeral. And we saw a degree of that with Al-Shifa Hospital, which was cleared months ago. And then Israeli forces had to go back in and re-clear that complex in recent weeks because Hamas was able to reconstitute to some degree. Now, there are challenges with this. It obviously takes a fairly substantial force. Keep in mind, we had 165,000 Americans alone just during the surge in Iraq. And it would take tens of thousands in Gaza to carry out this kind of campaign. But if you don't do that, Hamas will repeatedly reconstitute. Yes, it will be whittled down each time because obviously Israel controls the entire perimeter of Gaza, including really down in the south. They're going to make sure that crossing with Egypt is very carefully watched as well. But in that sense, I think, again, the big lesson is how to conduct a comprehensive civil military counterinsurgency campaign that uses essentially what we call gated communities. You literally might put a wall across the northern third of the country with a couple of entry control points, use biometric ID cards to determine who people are and to verify that they're not part of Hamas or the Palestinian Islamic Jihad. And then you very rapidly need to flood the area with humanitarian assistance, restore basic services, repair the very extensive damage to infrastructure and civilian dwellings and so forth. Because the overarching goal of this operation should not just be retribution for the horrific, barbaric actions on 10/7. It should also be to provide a better future for the Palestinian people in Gaza, because they will no longer be burdened by Hamas in and among them and governed by Hamas, which, of course, they're not going to allow to happen again. So in that sense, I think there are some very real lessons of recent history that, while recognizing the much greater difficulty and challenge posed by the situation in Gaza, nonetheless, there are some lessons to be had. I should just note, I've had these discussions with the Minister of Defense of Israel. I was out there about a month ago with his number 2, with his policy director, and with a number of others on that trip. And I do acknowledge very much the challenges of keeping that number of forces in that area, given that obviously this is largely a reserve force when you do the real expansion. And at one point, they had 7% of the workforce actually in uniform, and that's just not sustainable for Israel economically. They'll be allocating shortages, as we say. No commander has ever had all that he wanted in terms of troops funding. Now it's bandwidth, predators, or what have you. But I think those lessons are actually pretty relevant. But I also should note, to be fair, that it took us years to actually figure out how to do this properly. We wrote a counterinsurgency field manual. In fact, during the one tour, the one command that I was not in combat as a general officer, I oversaw the organization that had the Doctrine Center in it. We also controlled all of the commissioned, non-commissioned warrant officer education programs, the scenario in the National Training Center. I had 6 different hats in that organization, and it was called the engine of change for our Army. But it wasn't until then that we actually had a counterinsurgency field manual, which becomes the intellectual foundation for the conduct of operations. And of course, Israel, again, to be fair, has never done this in recent memory. Its urban operations in recent years have largely been short, punitive raids into Gaza to destroy a terrorist location or infrastructure and then to withdraw, or, of course, back the operations that they conducted in southern Lebanon back in 2006. And so they're doing discovery learning. That's understandable. And I hope that drawing on some of this more recent history could help them as they try to craft the right campaign, not just to destroy Hamas, but to ensure that they cannot reconstitute. And then, of course, to provide a better life for the Palestinian people by, again, providing the humanitarian assistance, being very careful in the conduct of operations to avoid unnecessary casualties and damage, and then rebuilding Gaza so that future can actually materialize.
And I'm also going to add something to that, and that's that their educational system needs to be changed as well, that they're not taught hate and they're not taught that martyrdom is a beautiful thing, there's a whole host of things.
Part of a comprehensive approach is all of those actions. We could diagram this, and it was basically called the anaconda slide, because what you have in the center are the bad guys. The next concentric circle has all of the elements that they need to sustain themselves. An ideology and this kind of education, if you will, would be one of those. And then around that, you have all the assets that you and the host nation partner are trying to bring to bear to deprive them of those. And so it's not just military activity. It's, again, all of the above. And that's the way it has to be approached.
Right. It's a complete package. Just two other points as it relates to that conflict before we move on to the book. But I suppose it's all really related because the book is, after all, called Conflict. When the Biden administration...
We're doing a chapter on Gaza as we speak for the second edition.
Oh, you are? Okay. When can we expect that, General? No pressure?
I think in the fall.
Okay, we look forward to that. When the Biden administration said they want Israel to express restraint because they don't want to inflame the region, they don't want it to grow into a larger conflict, one of my first reactions, General, was maybe this should grow into a larger conflict, and once and for all, Iran and its proxies should be dealt with. And I'm just wondering, and first of all, I realize that I'm not the one that's going to be called up into war. I'm not the one that's putting my life on the line, but I'm just wondering, am I off the mark in thinking that? In other words, is there a benefit if it does grow into something larger?
If you want to get into another major war, that's one way to do it. But I think that we've learned that these regime change operations don't always turn out the way we'd like them to, number one. Number two, this one would be enormously costly. This would be Iraq times many times. The regime really does have a lot of capability. And if you truly want to achieve what you set out, we'd have to go in on the ground. You're not just going to do this with air and missiles and drones and so forth. You would have to go in and do what we did in Iraq, except you'd have to have a vastly larger force given the vastly larger population. I'm more than a bit skeptical of that idea. It has some attraction. Let's get rid of this problem. Getting rid of this problem would be incredibly costly. It also, of course, would torpedo to some degree the global economy, because it would probably result in the price of Brent crude spiking fairly high. And you'd take off the Iranian oil that's being exported right now, about 1 million barrels a day. And that is actually the incentive they have to ensure continued freedom of navigation in the Gulf. So, in fact, it's that kind of eventuality that the Biden administration, I think, understandably wants to avoid. Now, there are lesser included operations that could be carried out. And certainly if Iran was ever to threaten to enrich to weapons grade and actually make a nuclear device, I think the administration would follow through on the commitment that it and everyone before it has made, which is that Iran will never be allowed to have a nuclear weapon. And I should note that while that has become a more challenging mission over the years since we first developed the plan to destroy that program when I was the commander of U.S. Central Command, it's all publicly known, and actually rehearsed that plan one time in the United States, it has gotten tougher since then. Still, I think, could be done. But again, I think we should have learned from the experiences of the post 9/11 wars that rolling the iron dice, as Bismarck termed the decision to go to war, doesn't always turn out the way that you hope it would be.
Got it.
Beyond that, I think it's understandable that this is one of those issues. There's that great saying in political science that where you stand on an issue depends on where you sit in the bureaucracy or in the world. And in this case, if you sit in Washington, you're saying to Prime Minister Netanyahu, take the win. This is a great success. They threw everything at you. And with our help, because we took down about a third of what was launched at Israel, with our help and your spectacular layered air and drone and ballistic missile and cruise missile defenses with Iron Dome, Spider, David Sling, Arrow, and even Patriot, you did a spectacular job. And in some ways, it actually shores up deterrence because it tells Iran that, look, you think you can do something to Israel? You didn't do all that well because 99% of what you sent was knocked down. Fair number of them apparently malfunctioned, didn't even launch. So that should undermine your confidence in your ability, and it should shore up the confidence, again, of Israel and even some other countries in that region. But from the point of view of the Israeli leadership, I think it's understandable that they say this was unprecedented. Never before has Iran directly attacked Israel from its soil. The number of items that was sent down range was well over 300. They couldn't anticipate that we were going to be able to knock them all down and avoid serious bloodshed. So they presumably intended to bring about considerable loss of Israeli lives, and they have to respond. And I actually talked to a very senior member in the war cabinet yesterday and came to understand very clearly that they feel that something so unprecedented can't be ended with a successful defense. It has to be followed by some significant retaliation, which is what they believe really will restore the rest of deterrence, keeping in mind that deterrence, of course, is always the adversary's perception of your capabilities on the one hand and your willingness to use them on the other. The challenge is that they don't want to see it escalate further, and yet they do want to send a meaningful signal. And that's a bit threading a needle with a fairly thick piece of string here, if you will. And that's what I think they're discussing, and when they might do that, what they might do, how to send a message without, again, leading to further escalation, which Iran clearly does not want. They announced that this is essentially the end of their response to the Israeli operation in the annex of the embassy in Damascus that killed 2 general officers in the Revolutionary Guards Corps Quds Force, one of whom is particularly senior and was very likely one of the individuals overseeing the provision of arms, ammunitions, and so forth to Hamas.
In general, just one other point before really we get onto the book, the hostages, which you invoked, which are really deep in our minds and in our hearts, as well as their families. How do you even approach negotiating for their release with these, we'll call them savages, which is being generous, but savages, which really are keeping them, and God knows how many are even still alive. And we've heard the horror stories about what they're really going through.
You try to find a formula that can get out as many additional ones, having already done this once. So we know how to do this. And it did, if the metric is gaining release of hostages, they achieved, again, a considerable success in the previous round of negotiations, noting, though, that it might be as many as 10 Hamas or other detainees released for every single Israeli. And I think you probably also have to recognize that this next round is probably not going to be the end, because I suspect that some of the male hostages and those that are not elderly or what have you will still be kept. But you go about trying to get the best deal that you can, because they've been in captivity now for a very long period of time. And as you note, it's certain that a number of them have died in captivity at this point in time.
All right. We pray for their speedy release and that everyone comes back safe and sound indeed. All right, listen, on to the book. Once again, Conflict, the Evolution of Warfare from 1945 to Ukraine. I absolutely plowed through the book. As I mentioned before we started rolling, I took 5 pages of notes on the book, and that was probably not even enough because there's so much in there. I first want to ask you really, how did the book come about, and what was it like collaborating with Andrew Roberts on it?
The collaboration was delightful. He's a serious scholar. He's very productive. This is his 20th book.
Yeah.
But the first for which he had a co-author. And it came about because he proposed the idea to me. We've done a lot of stuff together in the past on the stage, interviewing each other at different events in New York and London and the Clifton Literary Festival and so forth. And I've always enjoyed him very much. And he called up after the Russians invaded Ukraine and said, there should be a book that provides the military history context for this. And I don't see one. Would you be interested in writing it with me? And I jumped at the chance because I've been looking for an opportunity to try to capture the history of the two wars I was privileged to command at their height, Iraq and Afghanistan, and then also to revisit Vietnam, which was the subject of my PhD dissertation at Princeton. But I wrote it 10 years after the end of the war, and now we're many decades since then. And there have been a number of further memoirs. There have been various papers declassified, much more scholarship, and so forth. And then also to provide as an intellectual foundation or touchstone for the book in the introduction, the description of the importance of strategic leadership and what strategic leadership, the four tasks of a strategic leader are. Now we're talking generally about the most senior leaders. So the civilian leader who makes the decision to go to war or says this will not stand, about the Iraqi invasion and occupation of Kuwait, or Maggie Thatcher, who said the same about the Falklands. And then very quickly, it's the senior military commander, sometimes collaborating with those in the Pentagon or in London. But that individual has to perform four tasks superbly if his side has a chance to prevail. You have to get the big ideas right. You have to craft the right strategy. You have to have a deep understanding of the physical terrain, the human terrain, the various elements of society, the tribes, the sects, religious sects, the political parties, the other components of society, the neighborhood, how the country is supposed to run, how it really runs, all of this, so that, again, you craft the right strategy. And I should note that we did not have a sufficiently granular understanding of the situation in Iraq when we invaded it, nor, frankly, Afghanistan, although that was pressing because that was really driven by the need to eliminate the sanctuary in which the 9/11 attacks were planned by al-Qaeda when the Taliban ran Afghanistan at that time. Then the leader has to communicate the big ideas, the breadth and depth of the organization, and to everyone who has a stake in the outcome of the conflict. And there's a whole variety of ways that you do that. The third task is to oversee the implementation of the big ideas. This is really what we often think of as leadership. It's the example the leader provides, the energy, the inspiration. It's attracting and retaining the very best people. It's allowing those not measuring up to move on to something else. It's the organizational architecture that you design. That's not trivial, and it's not easy either. We didn't get the right organizational architecture in Afghanistan for about the first 8 years or so, nor did we get the big ideas right for that for, again, about 7 or 8 years as well, much less the right levels of resourcing and so forth. And then it's the metrics that you use to determine whether you're winning or losing, and it's how the leader spends his or her time. That's crucial because you drive the implementation of a campaign plan. And the campaign plan, of course, captures the big ideas, the strategy, you communicate it. Now you're overseeing the execution, and you drive it by the meetings that you conduct. You drive it by your recurring events, and you have to get the frequency of those. You drive it by going out and seeing it for yourself. 2 days a week minimum, we would go out and I'd go on patrol with a small unit to get a feel for this and to understand those who were trying to translate the big ideas into real action outside the wire, doing what only they can do, which is to engage the enemy and also to engage the population whose lives we were trying to, and also to provide better security. And then that battle rhythm also includes events that enable you or force you to perform the fourth task of a strategic leader, which is to determine how you need to refine the big ideas, how you have to adapt the strategy as the context changes and as your progress or setbacks accumulate so that you can do it again and again. And this we lay out in the introduction, and then we revisit it in most of the conflicts that we examine, noting that there's a number of cases in which, again, our leaders failed to get the big ideas right. 13 years in Vietnam before we finally crafted the right strategy and the right campaign design. And by then, it was after Tet, it was really too late. Although it did produce some results that enabled the South to hold on longer than would have been the case otherwise. But for years, we were conducting a war of attrition against an enemy that we could not out-attrit. We were doing search and destroy operations, which had very ephemeral effect. You might every now and then run into the enemy in the jungles and the mountains and so forth of Vietnam, but then you kill 10 of them for every one of us. But then you leave the area and they just re-infiltrate and they send more from North Vietnam down the Ho Chi Minh Trail or what have you. So again, that was not the right strategy. And in fact, the body count, which is the big metric, because if you're in a war of attrition, that should mean something, that turned out to be the wrong metric as well. It should have been something having to do with security of the population in the villages and hamlets, which is what the Southern leaders asked us to help them with when we first went in the mid-1950s. And when we cavalierly said, no, what you need is big units because you're going to get invaded from the north across the demilitarized zone, just as happened in Korea. And we've all just come from Korea, and those lessons are foremost in our mind. And then cases where we very much got the big ideas right, or back and forth. I'd like to believe that the surge that mattered most, for example, was the surge of ideas. And by the way, the big ideas of the surge were 180 degrees different from what it was that we'd been doing before. People say a lot about change management. You cannot change anything more than 180 degrees. And I had resistance from the prime minister who wanted to continue what we'd been doing and accelerate it. I said, we're losing. You want to lose faster? And so finally he acceded to my desires to pursue the strategy that we knew we needed to pursue, which was once again to live with the people, because that's the only way that you could secure them, and to take back control for security from the Iraqi security forces, which had been battered into ineffectiveness by the extraordinary violence of the previous year. Strategic leadership, that is what really matters. And I believe that model captures what a strategic leader has to do, and has to do properly, has to do it right, if that side is to have a chance to prevail. Noting that the great strategic leader of the Indochina and then Vietnam wars of the French and Americans, the best was actually the North Vietnamese leader, General Giap, who defeated the French at Dien Bien Phu and then oversaw the execution of the strategy that led about the collapse of the South some 15 years later.
In general, when it comes to strategic leadership and the lessons learned from them, from one conflict to another, how is it transmitted or institutionalized here in the United States? Yeah. And to what extent are those lessons really invoked when battle planning is underway?
There's an acronym that we use to ensure that we are not just learning lessons locally, let's just say, or maybe just in all of Iraq, but then you want to institutionalize them. And the position I had as a 3-star between my 3- and 4-star tours in Iraq had most of these elements that actually are the ones that institutionalize lessons, ensure that they are fully included in these different elements. So doctrine, so you update your manuals, organizational structure. And again, the doctrine directorate was under me as a 3-star. The organizational structure, I had a lot of influence on that as well. Training, I oversaw the scenario for the National Training Center, which was the mission rehearsal exercise. We overhauled that from still force on force, but with no civilians on the battlefield, no insurgents, no locals, no host nation security forces, to one that had all of those elements, and villages and urban terrain and improvised explosive devices, suicide bombers, you name it. So that was a much more realistic preparation for what it was that our forces would do on the ground in Iraq. And then we had another variant for Afghanistan, which was this different context in various ways, nowhere near as urban for starters. Then there's leader development. I also oversaw, as I mentioned earlier, all of the professional development courses for commissioned, warrant, and non-commissioned officers. So we overhauled all of that. I remember I went out to the Field Artillery School very early on in that 3-star tour, and they were training just the way they always had. Large massed battalions of artillery. We weren't shooting battalions. We weren't barely even shooting batteries. In fact, many of the artillery units were being used for other missions, route security, controlling an area of responsibility as infantillery, as it was called, detainee operations, you name it. And there was no training on that in the advanced course for the captains who were going to be the battery commanders and so forth, and would actually implement those missions. So overhauled it very quickly. In fact, we shut down the advanced course for a week or two, just shut it. And all of the students who had all been in Iraq, which their general officer leadership there at that time had not yet experienced, they helped to overhaul the courses that they were going to actually receive. And then there is materiel. So there's a whole process for identifying materiel requirements, which then go to the Army Materiel Command, and they're eventually translated into requests for proposal, an actual contract, so that actually produces the up-armored Humvees, or much later, the mine-resistant armor-protected vehicles, more Predators, more variety of other sophisticated items that we needed for intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance, et cetera, et cetera. And then there's even one for P and F, which is personnel, so certain personnel policies, so that you institutionalize what it is that you're learning, and then also facilities that enable you to carry out the training and the other tasks that are necessary. So once a month on my battle rhythm, there was an hour video conference back to the individual at Fort Leavenworth who replaced me in that 3-star command, and we would work our way down LMPF, doctrine, organizational structure, training, leader development, material requirements, personnel, and facilities, so that he would then ensure that the entire Army benefited from these lessons by truly institutionalizing them.
Thank you for that, because I was wondering throughout the book, because there were so many lessons that were learned, again, how is it transmitted? So thanks for that.
A process for learning them in Iraq itself. So
you mean just for Iraq?
To identify them first for institutionalizing throughout Iraq before sending them back to the Army. So we had on the ground, there were a number of full colonels that oversaw the Army lessons learned team that was with our units, the Marine Corps lessons learned team, Special Operations lessons learned team, Asymmetric Warfare Group, Counterinsurgency Center, all these different organizations, which were our institutions out there. And once a month, there was a process that culminated in them spending an hour with me and then sharing what they believed should be lessons, but lessons not learned when the lessons learned team identifies it. It's learned when it's actually incorporated in the big ideas in some way, communicated effectively, and then actually brought into the implementation phase. And so that was one. And then also I met once a week with the strategic level planners at my headquarters, the operational level planners, the 3-star headquarters, because they essentially needed to force me to make certain decisions. And a lot of those decisions would be based on the evolution of the context in which we were engaged, and again, lessons learned. And so you had a process to do that first in the war zone, and then, as I said, once a month, I personally would push it back to the 3-star, but he also had his lessons learned teams out there that were sending stuff back. So it's a big organization, and there's a lot of this that goes on. But you have to do that, because otherwise your Army or your Marine Corps is not learning institutionally. It's just some units out in the field that are doing that.
Yeah, and they have to rely on best practices. Otherwise, they're reinventing the wheel all the time. At the outset of the book, you pointed out that Joseph Stalin was intent on extending Marxism-Leninism wherever he found a lack of Western resolve. And that notion of a lack of Western resolve really resonated with me as I was reading the book. And I'm wondering if you can weigh in on the dangers of the lack of Western resolve, especially today in 2024, vis-a-vis China, vis-a-vis Iran, and also Russia.
One of the points that we make repeatedly in the book is that what happens in one part of the world reverberates in another. Yeah. So if you have a red line in Syria over use of chemical weapons, and it turns out not to be a red line, that undermines deterrence out in the Indo-Pacific. Keep in mind that deterrence is a function of two elements. It's the potential adversary's assessment of your capabilities on the one hand, and of your willingness to employ them on the other. And if you're not willing to do something in some other location where you've made commitments or established red lines or supported allies and partners, and you're not willing to continue that, as we have struggled, for example, with continued assistance to Ukraine, which is essentially fighting NATO's war for it without our soldiers shedding any blood, and the return on the investment of our $43 billion in security assistance plus a like amount from Europe, and then even more from Europe when it comes to economic and humanitarian and so forth, the return has been extraordinary. Destroyed half the tanks in the entire Russian military. It will take them a long time to rebuild when and if this eventually ends in some fashion. But we should recognize that, again, Putin's not done in Ukraine. He wants to go into Moldova. He wants to go into Lithuania, which is a NATO country, of course. And that would really open Pandora's box. But again, if you're worried about deterrence in another part of the world, most significantly, of course, when it comes to the relationship with China, then you've got to make sure that your word is good in another part of the world. Remember what President Xi said after we withdrew from Afghanistan and the way in which we withdrew. He said, see, you can't count on the Americans And look at how it went. They're a great power in decline. So again, big deal that what happens in one place has influence in others, and it can either strengthen deterrence if you demonstrate great capability and determination, or it can demonstrate equivocation, which obviously undermines the assessment of your willingness to use your capabilities.
One of the themes of the book is how important morale is in determining the success or failure of a conflict. That kept popping up throughout the book. You talk about the Kuomintang, the Argentines in the Falklands, some of the Russian soldiers today who have very low morale. You talk about Israel in 48 and 67, the Ukrainians today. And just as an aside, General, I was in Israel for 3 weeks in January, and I met with wounded soldiers. And there was one in particular who had to have his leg amputated from the knee down. And he said, I can't wait to get a prosthetic so I can go back on the battlefield. He said, because I want to show my men that if I can do it, they can do it. And the morale across the board, as I know because you were just there, is absolutely incredible and remarkable. And I'm wondering if you can talk about the importance of morale, where it comes from, it being an important weapon in the success or failure, if you will, of a war or a campaign.
Well, morale begins by soldiers having a sense that the mission they're performing really matters. So in the case of Ukraine, if you see this as their war of independence, which I think is an accurate description, or in Israel as a fight for Israel's survival, this is the worst day in Israel's history, was 10/7. And by the way, to put it in context for Americans, we lost not quite 3,000 innocent civilians and others in the 9/11 attacks. Israel's losses in our per capita would equate to 42,000, with 7,000 taken hostage. So this is a truly traumatic event, and I'm not sure everyone really appreciates fully, but the soldiers do. And again, having been on the receiving end of that, they obviously believe this is a mission that is absolutely critical for the security of Israel going forward. Then it also has to do with the quality of leadership, whether they have confidence in the leadership, their confidence in the soldier on their right or left. Because again, when you really get into serious combat, it's not the American flag or democracy or these universal values. It's you don't want to let down that person on your right and left, the brotherhood of the close fight. That's what really matters there. And if you have confidence in them, again, that's a reassuring element for you. You can count on them to be your wingman, to have your back, if you will. It depends on how the soldiers feel that they're being cared for. Are the units making every effort they can to get them, hot coffee in the morning, or to get them a break in what they're eating at various times? Is there consideration for their various aspects of their well-being? Are they provided good equipment, good weapon systems, ample ammunition? All of these different factors are among those that determine the level of morale. And I have to also say that feeling that you're winning is pretty important too. I have to note that when we started the surge, Iraq was in various locations, including in Baghdad, in a sectarian civil war. This was a Sunni Shia civil war with enormous intensity. 53 dead civilian bodies due to violence every 24 hours just in the capital alone. So this was very severe, and our troops knew we were losing. And then when you turn it around and you drive violence down by over 85%, nearly 90%, and they know that, they can feel it. And soldiers come up. I was at West Point yesterday, in fact, and there were a number of mid-level officers who served in the surge. And they said this was night and day. I left in 2006. I came back a year later, and the entire country was transformed. And that really, I could tell actually by whether or not they wanted selfies with me. And the demand became so high that I could not get to meetings because I'd be ambushed all the way along. So what we had to do is we said once a month, sometimes more than that, in all these different locations where I had various offices or operations centers or went there routinely, once a month, we're going to do an hour of nothing but photos. And you could do, I forget how many in a minute. We used to do about 1,200 in an hour or so. And you'd have martial music playing. You'd have the flags behind you. People would just stand and watch for an hour as everybody would come up on the stage, is one by one. And we had it all down. And what's interesting is that mothers and fathers to this day come up and they have on their phone, they have the photo of their soldier and me, and they say, "General, do you remember our soldier?" And I'm tempted to say, yes, it looks like he was one of 1,200 in that hour alone with whom I had a photo taken. But believe it or not, again, it took about 4 to 6 months. But when it started to turn, all of a sudden, everybody wanted a selfie. So you can feel morale, you can tell, and then they'll relate it to you too. Especially in an army where soldiers they can be pretty forthright. They can be pretty direct, and we welcome that. You don't want to have an army that is just in receive mode, as the Russian army is to a degree, where it's just all top down. You want to get it from the bottom up. In fact, when it came to exercising initiative, I really wanted to promote that. This is a small unit war. And so one of the items in the counterinsurgency guidance that I drafted myself and would hit the send key on about every month or month and a half as I updated it, one of those was an admonition: promote initiatives. In the absence of orders, figure out what they should have been and execute aggressively. And that's part of the culture as well. And the soldiers love that. They want to be empowered. They want to be trusted. They want to be given the kind of opportunity for initiative and innovation and all the rest that is not found in these kind of top-down armies, such as that of the Russian Federation.
Interesting. I thought all the chapters were interesting, General, but I thought the chapter on the wars of the future was particularly fascinating. And I'm just wondering, is there an aspect of technology that you're especially interested in or that you're personally following?
Yeah, and it is unmanned systems, but it's not just in the air. It's not just these remotely piloted systems. It's also on the surface of the sea. And by the way, Ukraine has done this spectacularly, both air and maritime. They've sunk 30% of the Russian Black Sea fleet, forced the Russians to withdraw from the port of Sevastopol at Crimea. And that opens up the Western Black Sea so that Ukraine can actually once again export its grain and some minerals, which is very important for its economy and also very important for food security for Egypt and some other North African countries, keeping in mind that Ukraine exports normally about 25 to 30% of the world's grain. So they've done that brilliantly, but it's also systems underneath the surface of the sea, on the ground, in outer space, and the equivalent in cyberspace, which is very much present. And these systems increasingly, I believe, will no longer be remotely piloted. They will be algorithmically piloted. And the human involved in this will be the human on the loop who actually develops the instructions for that machine and establishes the conditions the machine has to meet before it can take a certain action. This is obviously that has some ethical challenges to it, but I think that this is where warfare of the future is going. And you can see this in Ukraine already. I was in Ukraine for 4 days a week ago, and the advances, they're cranking out tens of thousands of aerial drones. They're also experimenting with remote controlled machine guns and a variety of other adaptations, in addition to, as I said, the maritime drones that have been so lethal to ships of the Russian Black Sea Fleet. So there's going to be a transformation over time from what might currently be described as a small number of large platforms, the aircraft carrier most prominent among them, incredibly capable, exorbitantly expensive, heavily manned, and so forth, but unfortunately increasingly vulnerable because what can be seen can be hit, and what can be hit can be killed. Yes, it's got defenses, and they're demonstrating this in various places, including the Red Sea with our capital ships that are there. But over time, we're going to shift from that to a world of a massive number of smaller unmanned systems, many of which will not be remotely piloted, but as I said, will be algorithmically piloted and learning constantly thanks to the use of and capitalization on the qualities of artificial intelligence and machine learning.
And do we have the upper hand here in the United States on that technology?
Difficult to say that we have the upper hand in all of it. We have the top of the line stuff. But the truth is, I don't know that the top of the line stuff will be what will be decisive in the future, because as we look at Ukraine, first, I'm not sure the high flying, very large Reaper or Predator drones would survive in that environment. It's a much more lethal air defense threat and electronic warfare threat as well. And what's most effective is actually what's called these very cheap first-person view drones. In other words, you're looking at what the drone, where it's going, And it's a suicide drone, and it can fly for a certain amount of period. And at some point in time, before it runs out of fuel or battery, you want to strike something with it. And they're cranking out tens of thousands of these each month. And they continue to adapt them to figure out how they can continue to operate in an electronic warfare environment, because the Russians have trench EW, it's called, and the Russians are doing the same thing. So that kind of innovation. Nothing happens faster when it comes to military innovation than when you're in a war. And that was true of the war in Iraq, by the way. Again, during the surge, especially with Secretary Gates as the Secretary of Defense and Admiral Mullen as the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, they drove our military services to provide what we needed much more rapidly. I could not get my own service to purchase V-shaped hull armored wheeled vehicles, which I was already buying for the Iraqis with US money from South Africa and elsewhere. And yet we were not yet producing large numbers of those. And it was only when Secretary Gates came in and just cracked down. He said, we're going to have the mine-resistant armor-protected vehicle. So this improvised explosive device threat, which is so pernicious in the middle of the road, if you're flat-bottomed like an up-armored Humvee, it takes the entire brunt of that blast. If you're V-shaped, it goes up and out, and that's what we needed. And then there was a variant of that for Afghanistan called the all-terrain version of that, because the roads were much less paved and you did a lot of off-road operations in a country that includes the Hindu Kush Mountains. Again, innovation in combat is just light years faster than what happens in normal peacetime. And the trick actually for the U.S., in fact, is to overhaul our material requirements, requests for proposal, contract, and actual production, procurement and production of these newer systems in a much more rapid fashion than is typically the case.
General, I have 10,000 more questions, but knowing the fact that I want to be mindful of your time and the clock, as well as the fact that you are going to have a whole section on Gaza coming out towards the end of the year, how about I save some of those questions for another conversation? Then we'll also talk about your Gaza chapter after it comes out.
Sounds good.
Sounds like a plan. All right. Once again, the book is Conflict, The Evolution of Warfare from 1945 to Ukraine. General David Petraeus, really, once again, this has been an honor and a pleasure. I could talk to you all day about this. We want to thank you so much for joining us here on the One Way Ticket Show. And we'll have info and links to General Petraeus on the show notes page of this episode on our website, theonewayticketshow.com. And no matter where you are in the world, do shoot me an email, Stephen@theonewayticketshow.com. Share One Way Ticket destination. Let's even arrange a call and chat, because I'm always up for a great conversation. Meantime, it's a wrap for this edition of the One Way Ticket Show. For General David Petraeus and the entire crew, I'm Stephen Shalowitz, and we'll see you next time.